Hey class, in this video we will be talking about generative patterns. We're going to continue working on the project that we created in the previous video on nested loops, but we'll add some randomness and some variation to create generative patterns, or patterns that are a little bit different every time that you load them. And we're going to use some different constraints and things to make sure that those patterns kind of have similar qualities. So let's get started. I'm going to open up GitHub as usual and make sure I'm up to date. And let's go to show and finder. So I'm going to work off of what we started in the previous video for pattern 3. So I'm just going to duplicate that and call this pattern 4. And I'm going to load this up in Sublime. And so I'm going to open up pattern 4 and edit the index.html. So I'll call this a generative pattern. Okay, and change this to generative pattern. And so what generative basically means is that it's different every time. Like we generate it new from scratch every time we create the pattern. And so that's something that's very unique to code. We can't really do that with just like a Photoshop document or like an Illustrator design file or something like that. It's really with code that we can make something that has certain constraints, and then we generate something new each time. We can look at a few examples of some generative patterns. So we can just Google it. If we could just Google generative pattern, we'll see some cool examples. I'll go to images. And so you can see some basic stuff like this is a generative pattern that's using a few different shapes to create kind of like a maze looking thing, but it'll always be a little bit different. Here's another nice one. Okay, here's a cool one here. And you can see there's a lot of variation to the types of generative patterns. Some of them are made by computers, some of them are made by hand, some of them, this is kind of a cool animated one. And so you can see one of the similarities is that there's a lot of repetition. Repeated shapes, repeated colors, and repeated relationships, geometric and spatial relationships in all of these patterns. So we're gonna look at how to build a basic pattern like this just using P5. And once we learn some of the basics, maybe we can try to recreate some of these examples. All right, so let's get started. I'm gonna open up sketch.js. I'm gonna leave our nested loop intact. So I'm just gonna change the comment here to generative pattern. And we're gonna leave this nested loop intact. So we have our width, our height, we have our columns, our rows, and we have the ellipse. And so I'm not going to go over all of that again. Hopefully as we build our pattern, it'll become clear like why things are happening. But you know, we can review that, or you can review the video if you want to cover the nested loop again. So I'm just going to start with my ellipse and start by adding a bit of variation. And so one thing that you'll notice right from the beginning is that because we're using the draw loop and we're refreshing all the time, using randomness is a little bit tricky. So let's just add a random color for our ellipse. So let's create a R, let's say random 255, a G for green, a B for blue, and then we'll fill RGB. And so when we reload our page, we'll see so I'm going to go to localhost 8080. And this is pattern version 4. So now this looks pretty crazy because our pattern is getting refreshed every single frame because we're still inside of this draw loop. So we can do something similar to what we did in our previous generative pattern example where we're using a lot of randomness. We can just change the draw function. We can change that to pattern, and then we can call pattern from setup. So this way it just calls once instead of a whole bunch of times. And if we refresh the page, we can refresh our design. We can also refresh our design interactively by adding a mouse pressed function and just calling pattern again. So now if I click, oops, I spelled mouse wrong. So now if I click, we get different patterns each time. So there's different ways that we can approach this, and there's different ways that we can randomize what we see on the screen. So we can start just by like randomizing the actual width and height of our design. Like if I do a random width here, if I say the width could be random from 50 to 100, now the width of our design is going to change each time. And let's change this now, since this is hard coded. Let's just leave that at 0 so we don't have to worry about that. And let's set our height to the same thing as width. So now we don't have to worry about changing stuff. And let's also set y equal to 0. So now we can see as we refresh the pattern, we get a different size every time. And that can be a really dramatic difference. Like we could do like 20 to 100, or we could do all the way up to like 500. Sometimes those patterns are going to be really large. So we can create randomness even outside of our for loop. Let's stick with something a bit of a smaller range. Sometimes you can see that we don't get quite to the bottom here. So if you want to fix that, we can actually just add the height to the height. So that way it always goes over. We can add the width to the width just to make sure it goes over. And I think you'd be fine with width over 2 there as well, but this just makes it a little bit simpler. So we can do some variation in terms of the overall size of the pattern. So we can also do some variation to the color. Right now we're just using a lot of different colors. It's completely random. But by adding some constraints, we can set colors to different values. So we can create kind of more of a pattern that has a little bit more sense behind it. So I'm actually going to change this to a stroke. I think I can get kind of a cool effect here if I do a kind of like a big stroke weight and then no fill. So I kind of have some cool overlapping patterns there. I could even add a bit of alpha here if I want things to overlap more. So that looks kind of fun. I'm going to do the stroke weight up even more. I'm just kind of playing around with the different possibilities at this point. Let's make a slightly darker background as well so we can see how that stands out a bit more. So that's kind of fun. We're kind of like overlapping in different places, using different colors, but we can also change the colors that we see. So maybe we want, let's say if we wanted mostly blues, we could reduce the level of red a bit. So we could say like maybe the reds only go up to 150, maybe the greens only go up to 100, and the blues are somewhere between 0 and 255. With this, you can still see we get some very red. So if we want to make sure that there's always at least a little blue, we can raise the minimum value for blue for a bit. So now we have a lot more blues. We still have some red, so maybe I'll raise that even more to 200. So now there's a lot of blue. Maybe we'll make the red even smaller. Okay, so we have a lot of nice blues in this pattern. Maybe we can also change the color based on the position. So a nice way to kind of divide different parts of our canvas is choose a point where, you know, maybe we could say we want to have the top be kind of like the sky and the bottom be kind of like maybe some grass, so it would be more green. So we could set like a line. Maybe we could call that like the horizon or something like that. We can say random. Let's say it has to be at least height over 2 to height. Okay, so we'll just set this horizon line and we'll say if y is greater than the horizon. Okay, so that means it's at the bottom of the page. We'll do more greens. So that'll be kind of like the grass. So to do this, I can't just copy and paste this in here. That could lead to errors. So I'm just going to declare red, green, and blue to start. And then I'm going to copy red, green, and blue. And actually, let's do if y is less than the horizon. So this will be more blue. And then else, if we go beyond that number, then we'll do more green. So we'll still do R as random to 100, but then we'll swap the green and the blue. So green will be random 200 to 255, and B will be random to 100. So now we have more greens at the top and more blues at the bottom. I guess if the horizon is like all the way at the bottom of the page, doesn't look good. So maybe we'll say somewhere between height over 2 and height, let's say minus width. So there's at least one row that way. And let's actually make our shapes a bit smaller. I think that'll look better with the current design we're going with. And maybe let's actually go back to our fill. And let's try no stroke. Let's see how that looks. That might look better. So that looks good. We still have a lot of grid here. So one way that we can kind of break out of this like very obvious grid feeling is to add some randomness within each individual cell. So we have to stick with X, Y, width, and height. That's what actually determines the placement of each one of our cells. But that doesn't mean we can't add a little randomness inside there. So we could say X plus random between -10 and 10. So we'll get some randomness on the X value. And that looks kind of cool on its own. Maybe you would want to just like stick with that. And maybe we could even, you know, change the columns. We could say like height over 2 to get a little more dense. That looks kind of nice. So there's a lot of different stuff we could do there. Let's increase that randomness even more. And so you can see we get like some streaks of colors and other things. We can also add some randomness to the Y. One thing you might want to do at this point, if we're adding a lot of different code, is we can just break these out into different lines. So it's a little bit easier to read this way. So then for the Y, we could say plus random -10 to 10. You can also use variables like the width and the height here if you want to make sure it doesn't go out of a certain range. But this is pretty cool. We can also change the width and the height. So we could say width plus random 50. So maybe some of them will be really big. And height plus random 50. So now we have lots of different types of shapes. If you want not to have ellipses, if you want everything to be a circle, we can just take out the height altogether. And so we're still using the height as a value to determine how big our rows are up here. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to use it in our ellipse. So this doesn't even really, at this point, we don't even really see the grid, but we're kind of like filling up these spaces really well because we're using those loops to distribute all of our shapes across the scene. Another thing we can do is we can actually use a map for a gradient. So for example, if I want my sky to get more blue or less blue as it goes along, I could actually map one of these Y values. So let's say instead of red is random, let's say red is map Y from 0 to height. We're not actually going to get to height because eventually we'll hit this horizon, but we can map Y from 0 to height and 0 to 100. Or let's do a little bit more, let's say 255. Okay, so now we can see it's a little bit random because of the blue and the green, but it's consistently getting more red as we go down the screen. So that's another way to kind of change the overall pattern that we're creating using the map function that we learned in a previous lesson. So another type of decision that we can make is a random decision for different shapes. So right now we're always drawing the ellipse and we're changing the color, we're changing the size a bit, but let's try also making different shapes. So for that one, I'm actually going to make another copy of this because I want to preserve this example for you guys. So I'm just going to duplicate pattern version 4 and make pattern version 5 and kind of start this one from scratch. But you, again, don't need to have 2 versions of this. You just need 1 version of this. So let's go to pattern 5. And I'm going to delete everything here. And I'm just going to start with like a really simple shape. And then we'll make some changes to it. So I don't need this horizon anymore. I'll leave the width and the height as is. But I'm going to make something more similar to maybe something like this, where it just kind of chooses from a few different shapes and then decides where to put them. So let's just start with like a default shape. Let's just like make a line. So I'm going to say no fill. I'm going to make a stroke and let's just say it's black. So I won't even play with color, at least not for the beginning. You can combine all these different techniques into one place if you want to do that as well. So I'm going to just have a black stroke, and I'm just going to draw a line from x, y, okay, to x plus w, y plus h. And so basically what that's doing is each one of our cells, okay, if we think about each cell in our grid, it starts at xy here, and then this is width and this is height. So if our first point is xy, it's going to be right there. If our second point is x plus w, okay, it's going to be over here, x plus w. So we're going to move over here, and then y plus h is down here. And then if we draw a line between those two parts, we're going to draw a line across the cell. It's a little tricky to get the math, but once you get it, it's pretty simple. And let's increase the stroke weight a bit. So I'll say like 10. And so now we just get lines going all the way across the page because each one of our cell has the same lines. And so if we change, we kind of get different lines. Okay, so that's when we always have the same line. But now let's try doing another line. So I'm going to take this line out, and this time I'm going to draw a line. And instead of going a diagonal, let's say this is our cell, let's draw a line in the other direction and see how that looks. So now we're going to say x plus w, we're going to start on the other side, and y is at the top. And then we're going to move over to x and y plus h. So I just kind of swapped the x values here. Okay, now we're going the other direction. So now, what if I switch between these two choices randomly? Okay, so how do I do that? I can just pick a random number and then choose one or the other based on that random number. So it's kind of like our coin flip. So I can say variable r, or let's say let r since we're in the for loop. And let's just say random 2. So let's say there's going to be two choices. So if r is less than 1, then we'll draw the first line. And else, if r is greater than 1, we'll draw the second line. So there's a 50-50 chance, right? Because if r can only be between 0 and 2, there's about a 50-50 chance that it'll be less than 1 and about a 50-50 chance that it won't be. Okay, all of a sudden we have a pretty interesting pattern, right? Just by using two different lines. And also by varying the size of our cells. So that was pretty cool. That was pretty easy. What else can we draw in here? Even just drawing like some straight lines will create some variation. So if we have, I'm going to take out one for a second and say line, let's just say x, y, x plus w, and y. This is just going to draw a line straight across the cell. Okay, so now we get like a completely different look just by making one small change. We can also change the probability. So if I said like 0.5, now it's 3/4 more likely to be a straight line versus a diagonal line. Okay, if I increase the probability, if I say 1.5, now that's a lot more likely that you'll have a diagonal line than a straight line. So there's a lot of different things that we can make variations of here, and we get a lot of different results. So let's add an else if in here. So let's do 3 now, and we'll say else if r is less than 2. So then we'll draw the line that we had before, and then we'll say else again. Okay, so now we have 3 different lines. Now we have some weird different types of patterns because we have different diagonals. So the result of something very simple can be really pretty crazy. And we can also change the amount of variation here as well. And we can also randomize those values if we want to. So there's a lot of different stuff that we can do. Like I could even make this value random. So I could say random of 1 and random of 2. Okay, so that create some different types of variations because it's all based on randomness now. And so really I'm just combining like a few very simple things, and the result is something that's like because we're using generativeness and randomness, we get all these really interesting different results. Okay, so that's pretty fun. I'm going to try one more thing, which is a little bit more advanced. It's a little bit of a gambit. I'm not sure if it's going to work. I'm going to make the lines a little bit smaller actually so I can see the geometry better. So I'm going to try to include an arc in what we've got already. And so I want to think a little bit about how our grid works. So I'm just going to make like a a quick grid here. Let's say we have like a couple rows and some columns. So as we're going through, we're adding random lines. So there might be a line like this, there might be a line like this, whoops, there might be a line like this, and there might be a line like that. And so then maybe we have another line like this, and a line like this. And since it's random, maybe there's another line like that, and then like one like that, and then another one like this maybe, and like that maybe, and like this, and maybe like that. So it's going to kind of just choose a random one for each one of these cells. One thing I might want to do is add some different types of shapes. Something with some roundness might be nice. So maybe if I wanted to fit an arc in one of these. So if I was going to make an arc in here, maybe I would want it to like connect from here to there. Let's see if that would work. So that one would be a little tricky because the arc technically draws from the center. So that means the total arc would be like this. The center would be right here, but I'm only drawing from there down to there. Okay, so the arc position, if this is the XY, this is actually X plus W. We have to move over, and Y. And then it's drawing from down here. So 0's here, pi is here. So it's drawing from pi over 2 over to pi. So that's a little bit complicated, but let's give it a shot, see if it works. So now I've got random is 4, so I can add a fourth shape in here. So I'm going to say else if r is less than random 3. This is actually kind of confusing. So let's go back to just 1, 2, 3. So keep in mind you can add randomness to literally anything that's a number. You just kind of have to understand what the expected range is. And let's take some notes. So this is diagonal, top left to bottom right. Okay, this is diagonal top right to bottom left. And this is just straight across top. Okay, so we're trying to connect our arc. So we're starting with an arc. We're going to start on the other side of the cell at the top of the cell. We're going to use width and height as a regular width and height. We might actually need to, oh no, that's actually somewhere where I might get tripped up. So if this is our cell, here's our arc, and we want to draw from here to here, that's actually width plus width, height plus height. Okay, so that can be kind of tricky using an arc. So we need width times 2, height times 2. And finally, we're drawing from pi times 0.5 to pi. Okay, I think all of that is right. Let's take a look. Oh, not bad. So the arc does connect with the other shapes. It doesn't look exactly like what I imagined it would look like, but it is kind of nice. What if we draw the arc a little bit further? What if we just go straight from 0 to pi? No, that's too busy. So let's stick with, it really works where it works. Some places it doesn't quite work. But it's still kind of interesting, adds another layer of dimensionality to it. I guess you could probably do some complicated math to figure out when the arc is actually going to hit the lines and when it's not, but what I'm really doing is kind of just like putting random stuff together. So yeah, that looks kind of good. We could also change the arc. Like we could do, we could start at pi and go to pi over 5. That's probably going to look the same. Oh no, that's way bigger. So what if we did pi times 1.5? Yeah, it just kind of flips it around. It doesn't really change the overall idea of it. But of course, you could add more random numbers and more random arcs, and maybe you'd start to see something more interesting after that. So anyway, I'm just going to stop there because it is getting more complicated. That's basically the idea for this section. Instead of just randomizing the color, shape, and position, we can actually randomize what we're drawing. And so keep in mind that we have, pattern 5 is randomizing shapes and pattern 4 is randomizing color, position, and size. But there's no reason why you can't kind of mash those together. So you can make random choices about shape along with random choices about color. in the same pattern. So I'm going to take a couple screenshots of these guys. I'm going to say save. So we have something to publish. So I have my pattern version 5. I think I'll link to that one so there's not just like a million new links. So let's put that in there. Okay, so this is thumbnail for pattern version 5. So yeah, that's basically it. Let's add a link to the home page. So I'm going to go to index.html. I'm going to copy this guy. Whoops. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and copy this. And I'm going to include a few links here. But again, you only have to make one version of this project. You don't have to make two. So I think pattern version 5 is the one we did for the thumbnail. And so then we started pattern version 3. That's just kind of the nested loop example. I'm going to copy this and paste it a couple times. Pattern version 4 is generative pattern 1. And pattern version 5 is generative pattern 2. So again, you only need to do one for your homework. I just wanted to include a couple examples so that you can see those. So we have the nested loop. That's just our basic how to make a nested loop. Generative pattern 1 and generative pattern 2. Okay. So yeah, that's basically it. I'm going to go over to GitHub and say adds generative pattern examples and commit to master. So for the homework, feel free to play around with colors, shapes, sizes. Try to come up with something that's kind of fun or creative. If you want to make like something that's not as generative, that's just like a basic pattern, like something like that, feel free to do that as well, just by adding different shapes together, because that can be interesting as well. And yeah, just kind of look around at these different patterns, because there's a lot of different cool stuff that you can do. Some of these things are actually using transformations as well, which is kind of fun. I didn't really get into that, but that is definitely a possibility. Let me know if you guys have any questions on email, on Discord, or in class.